All right, today we are picking up with the hardships of the early industrial life. The new industrial cities of Europe underwent a process of urbanization, and this is a movement of people to the cities. Small towns around like coal or iron mines are going to boom, and the wealthy and the middle class were the ones who lived in the nice parts of town. The poor typically lived in the slum areas, and they had things like tenement buildings. They typically didn't have running water, very poor sanitation, and oftentimes they didn't have sewage facilities, and so a lot of disease runs rampant in these areas of those towns. And this all comes apart because of the factory system. It's a new way of life. People who worked in the factories worked long hours, usually 12 to 16-hour days. There was oftentimes accidents or dangers from things like the coal dust or accidents in the factory itself. Women were oftentimes hired because they could be paid less, so it was a cheaper form of labor, but they were also considered easier to manage. They could be more easily intimidated and asked to work longer hours and put up with more, basically. Child labor is also going to be utilized in the factories. A lot of times it's because the children are small and they could move quickly, more quickly than an adult could. They also had nimble fingers. And children often worked at this time in order to help support their family. Orphans were another source of child labor because they could be talked into or forced into working very long hours for minimum food or wages. The working class is then going to get a lot of protests from the artisans, because basically the artisans, these are people who are skilled in their particular job, and they felt that machines were costing them their jobs, that these machines were taking over where they had become very skilled and put in the time. And so they often would come in and protest and maybe smash some machines or burn the factories. This new industrial life is going to also come with it a new religious movement called the Methodists. And Methodism is brought about by John Wesley, and basically he felt that the belief in God is a personal sense of faith, and it endorsed sober and more moral ways of life. A new middle class is going to come about as well. People who were inventors of new ways to make the factories work better, investors, they kind of go from rags to riches. I mean, you could be a nobody and come in with this brilliant idea, and all of a sudden you're a billionaire. They lived pretty well, this new middle class. They had good houses, they had good meals, they had nice clothing. Women in this new middle class were encouraged to be ladies, and so they weren't supposed to do any physical labor. They were supposed to do things like the nobility would do, taking piano lessons, learning how to embroider, taking drawing lessons, that kind of stuff. And so they were basically being taught how to be the perfect wife, sort of. But it's again this hearkening back to wanting to be of the noble class and not actually having to do any physical labor. But this middle class is also going to value hard work. It's not like they don't think they should have to work. The reason they become middle class is because they are hardworking, and so they do value that hard work. But with this, we get new ways of thinking as well, especially about the economy and market system and that kind of stuff. Laissez-faire economics is going to become very, very popular, where the government is out of business. It has a hands-off approach to business. It doesn't interfere with it, so that business has the ability to then prosper and grow. Adam Smith is a popular economist, thinker about the economy. He endorses a free market economy, thinking that would help grow the economy more quickly. Thomas Malthus felt that the population growth was too fast, and because of that there could be some problems, and he looked at the way that the economic system was working with this population explosion, and the only checks on the population explosion were war, disease, and famine. And whenever the population increases, it's the poor who tend to suffer because they get less and less and less. And so his solution was we should have fewer children, because then we can put a check ourselves on our population. Along with this is a sense of utilitarianism, and this is kind of a goal for society, that the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, that we shouldn't have a population where the downtrodden are starving and poor and all kinds of stuff. And so basically this idea of utilitarianism is that it does a person bring more pleasure than pain to those around him? And so they're looking at that. Do you help people around you, or do you hurt the people around you? And so we start to see the countries of Europe sort of tend to be more socialist. Socialism is where the people as a whole own and operate the farms and factories and railroads and everything. And there's this belief in basic human goodness and social justice, that basically everybody's treated equally all the time. And so society operates for the welfare of all. Now, Karl Marx, who was a German, basically comes up with a scientific socialism, and he calls it his Communist Manifesto. And communism is a form of socialism that sees the class struggle between the employee and the employer as unavoidable, that there's always going to be the haves and the have-nots. And so Karl Marx is going to be saying, well, if our working class rises up, we can create a society where wealth and power are equally shared between the employee and the employer. And there will be little or less conflict between the two. At first, there's very little impact about this, but his influence begins to grow in terms of thinking in a socialist view or a communist view. The weakness is, however, is that the working classes of Europe really weren't all that bad off. Not enough to start a revolution anyway. They actually weren't doing so poorly. And nationalism is going to win out over worker unity. Nationalism of wanting your country to be successful, or wanting your town to be successful, is going to be more important than the workers uniting together to get back at the boss kind of thing. And so Karl Marx's predictions were actually wrong. The Industrial Revolution is going to continue to spread. It did not take long for other countries to catch up with Britain. And the reason for that is that Germany, France, the United States, they all had more abundant supplies of coal and iron and other resources, and so they just follow Britain's lead. Germany and the United States especially take over. However, it's an uneven development. Not all of them will develop very quickly, but the impact of this is that they do create jobs, and there is global competition. So now there's going to be fighting for getting the customers to buy your product over somebody else's. There's also new methods of production. Interchangeable parts, or identical parts that could be used in place of one another, are going to help with assembly, but they'll also help with repair. If something breaks, oh, I could take the part from this one and use it in the broken one. The assembly line process is also going to make production faster and cheaper, and each worker is going to be responsible for just a small portion of the work rather than putting the whole thing together. So you could basically specialize and become very, very good at your particular part of it. Technology and industry will change as well. Lots of things happening. They begin to purify the iron in order to make steel, and steel was lighter and harder and more durable. It's also cheaper than iron, and it will be used in tools and bridges and railroads. Excuse me. Chemicals are also going to see some major technological changes. Hundreds of products are going to be made, like aspirin and perfumes and soaps, fertilizers, margarine. All kinds of things will suddenly come onto the market. Dynamite, which is a safer explosive, is going to be invented, and actually the inventor wins the Nobel Peace Prize because he found a safer way to explode things. Electricity is going to be discovered and will become a power source. And that actually benefits the factories because the factories could remain open and productive after dark. The horseless carriage or the automobile makes transportation faster. Airplanes, the Wright brothers in the US. Passenger travel is not going to be possible yet, but eventually it will be used. So the first inklings of that. And communications are going to change as well. Telegraph, telephone, radio, all kinds of stuff. The role of big business as a result of the Industrial Revolution, corporations are going to form, and these are owned by many investors who buy shares of stock. And so in a tiny part, the owner of a share of stock is going to be an owner of the company. And so all of these things are going to lead to a wider world view and changes that will be taking place because of the Industrial Revolution.